Hello, and welcome to another edition of the series Conversations about Gossip. And so, in today's episode, I'll be talking to another guest about gossip and about their take on gossip. And I'm really looking forward to hear this conversation with Jim that I had. And I think it's going to be very enlightening to you. And I know that you'll enjoy listening to his perspective and the questions that we exchange back and forth. So this was another very good conversation that I had. Gossip is something that I feel truly passionate about, and about just getting out in the open the truth about gossip, because gossip is such a norm. Everybody thinks it's just so normal, and there's a lot of leaders who just don't know what to do about it. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to listening to this episode and gaining some really, truly good insights from Jim's perspective. All right, let's do it. Leading as a woman is tough, but leading as a woman of faith is next level. However, it doesn't have to be that way. God has called you into this leadership role because He says you are worthy. You are His child, and if He qualifies you, who in this world can unqualify you? You might suffer from imposter syndrome and believe you're not good enough, but God says you are good enough. Hi, I'm Rika, Whelan, Christian leader and workplace culture coach, and together we're going to navigate leadership with faith as our foundation. Let's get started. Grab your coffee or water, keep that notebook and pen handy, and let's jumpstart your leadership. Welcome, Jim, to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, Rika. Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. So why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so what I do now is I am a leadership consultant and coach and speaker and writer. I do all things leadership. But I spent 30 years in higher education in the States at a bunch of different institutions. I was an English professor for a very long time at a small university outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And then eventually I became a dean there. And moved on from there and was a vice president at a couple other institutions, all smaller institutions. And so I spent a whole career in higher ed before I turned to leadership consulting.
Okay, and that's so good, and it's a good point that you said, you turned to leadership consulting. So is it because you had a really big passion for leadership? It's something that you felt that you could offer other leaders, and are you only in the education space, or is it any industry?
All good questions. So I'll give you the full tale. How about that? So frankly, I've been a leader my whole life. I've been thrust into leadership positions as a kid in Boy Scouts. I was a boss at 18. I had employees, all the way through my life. I was a student leader. I was a union leader at one point, and then I became a faculty leader. And I was teaching English, and I was asked to become the dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the institution I was at. Now, I had always been what I call a gut leader, right? I didn't really study leadership. I knew nothing about it. And I figured, okay, well, I'm pretty good at it. I'd do okay. But when I was made a dean, the stakes were a lot higher. And what was even worse was I was the dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, but there was no School of Humanities and Social Sciences. So I had to found the school. So that was a whole nother task. But that turned out to be easy. That's just putting stuff together, nuts and bolts, right? This goes with that. No big deal. What was hard was getting it up and running and keeping it running. And what happened with that was I started realizing I needed to up my leadership game. How do you do that? Well, the normal thing to do is you turn to your bosses, right? You look at the people who are above you, see what kind of models they are. Mine were very poor models. They were clearly bosses and not leaders, and I make a distinction there. I looked at my peers, my fellow deans. They were flailing about wildly. I kind of imitated them for a while. I wasn't enjoying that, slipping into micromanagement and workaholism and all that. So I sort of stepped back at one point and realized that there's just got to be a better way. And I started studying leadership, treating it like a discipline. And I read up on leadership. I went to trainings. I have certificates. I hold a certificate in leadership in higher education from Harvard. I did a whole bunch of things with leadership, going to workshops, joining organizations, and really started learning to lead. And when I did that, I'm also very empirical by nature. So I tend to try things out and see what works. And I tried a lot of things out and I failed a lot and I learned from my failures. I learned that I can learn from other people's failures as well. I call that learning from the negative paradigm, watching people fail, watching systems collapse, and deriving lessons from that. And then eventually, like I said, I moved on from there. It was an extremely dysfunctional place. I was there for 14 years, 7 as a dean. And I moved on from there to another institution where I became a vice president and provost, and then was there briefly, and then moved to another one, again, another dysfunctional organization, and decided I've had it with higher ed, and I left. At that point, I started thinking about what do I like to do? And what I like to do is I loved working with young people and guiding them to become great leaders. So that's what I do. And that's how I got into the leadership space.
I think leadership is a really interesting topic of discussion, because before I became a leader, I also did not have any qualification or any experience for that matter. And the role that I had was quite a big role as well, similar to yours. It was a lot of responsibility. I had nearly 50 people reporting to me without any leadership, anything really, any leadership knowledge. So, in some senses, both of us, we learned as we go, but we realized that that's just not good enough. We need to understand. And so is there any, you went to Harvard, so you've got that qualification, but was there anybody else like that played a pivotal role in your leadership? Like a book that you read or an author or something like that? Because for me, it was John Maxwell. He's always been a really big part of my leadership role and what I've learned from him. But that's just all book knowledge, right? So is there anybody in particular that you could highlight for the listeners?
Yeah, there wasn't any single book or author. In fact, it's funny, I didn't really discover John Maxwell until the last few years. So I was completely ignorant of John Maxwell's existence. But yeah, I mean, I read a number of books. There were, and I read Simon Sinek. I was really into Daniel Pink, some of his writing on motivation and whatnot. There's a book that it has a slightly profane name, but it's a serious book from a Stanford University business professor. It's called The No Asshole Rule, which had a massive influence on me very early on. It's probably the first leadership and management book I ever read. And it really just shaped how I looked at the role of the leader and the role of individuals in an organization. It had a lot to do with culture and how individuals shape the culture, which is a big part of what I do. And he has Sutton. His name is Robert Sutton. He has another book called Good Boss, Bad Boss. He has quite a few, but that's a great follow-up to the first book. I used to read that when I had deans working for me. I would give them that book and we'd talk about different chapters and whatnot, because it's all very simple stuff. It's what I like about it. It's not, it's very practical. And what Sutton does is he just sort of lays it out there, and you look at it and you say, well, it's common sense. Yeah, but it's common sense that everyone seems to miss. So I love the fact that, someone just laid out, well, here's the obvious thing. Please do these things. It's not very heavily theoretical, although I do enjoy the theoretical books. More recently, I've been reading, one of my favorite authors is John Amici, out of Great Britain, who has a book called The Promises of Giants, which is superb. Really off the beaten track, different way of looking at leadership. And the idea is he's a very large man. In fact, he played for the National Basketball Association. He's huge, and he's a giant, physically a giant. And he realized that, when you are physically that big, you have to be careful how you move in the world. People pay a lot of attention to you. You can cause a lot of damage accidentally. And it's the same thing with leaders. So he uses that as a metaphor for the leader.
Well, that's so profound. I've never thought about it that way, because leaders do have a lot of impact and a lot of influence over over your team and actually over everyone as well. And I recently uploaded a podcast episode about the influence that you also have on your leadership peers. It's not just about your team, it's about your peers as well. It's kind of this 360-degree model, which is the John Maxwell's 360-degree model. Yeah, that's very interesting. And so you touched on workplace culture, and that book spoke about the importance of that. And so, the topic of discussion today, because, leadership plays a really important part in how we deal with workplace culture, but also then in particular workplace gossip, because the way we think about it and our thought processes and, whether we think it's important or not important will really be the way you deal with workplace culture or implement that in your workplace. So what's your experience with like workplace gossip? What's your background with that? Have you been a gossiper? Have you done that? Have you, worked with people who were gossipers? And so, just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think if anybody ever tells you they're not a gossiper, they're either self-deluding or just flat out lying. I mean, everyone gossips to some extent, and gossip can take a variety of forms, not always harmful. But the idea that you spreading dysfunction, spreading toxicity, using rumors, talking behind people's backs, spreading lies. I've experienced a lot of that. I've been a victim of that. I've witnessed a lot of that. When I was a university leader, I tried to shut it down as much as I could. But in many cases, I was in a deeply dysfunctional institution, and that was part of the dysfunction. Did the gossip create the dysfunction, or did the dysfunction create the gossip? I don't know, but they fed off each other, and that's for sure. And like I said, I was a victim of this, and I actually lost a job over gossip, which was just a very difficult thing to even contemplate, over complete fabrications and, no ability. You can't prove a negative. You can't say, well, this didn't happen when somebody else is saying it did, and you don't even know who that person is. You just can't fight that.
And I think that is the reality that, not only the listeners, but everybody else really has to be aware of, is the fact that gossip is not just this harmless banter thing that people make it out to be. It is really, really harmful. And so it's a really big shame that you actually had to lose a job over that. And I'm very sorry to hear that happened to you. But why do you think that happened? Is it because your workplace just did not have systems in place, or follow-up, or accountability, or basically nothing? What would you attest that to?
Nothing. In fact, in this case, it was the president of the university who was participating in the gossip. She wasn't spreading the rumors, but she was listening to complete nonsense. It didn't even make sense when you looked at it, and it became a gaslighting situation on top of that. At another institution where I was a dean, my boss, who was the provost, I almost got fired there because of a rumor too. I was called into his office. There's the head of HR, who was not a competent person, to say the least. And the two of them were accusing me of something that they heard that just was a totally innocent thing. I couldn't fathom what they were talking about. I couldn't defend myself because I didn't even understand what they were saying, because it made no sense at all. But they had heard this rumor and were ready to can me on that day. And I managed to talk my way out of it, but it was incredible. And that damaged my relationship with my boss forever. I could never trust him after that, if he was going to believe nonsense like that. The irony was that the person I know who was spreading that rumor spread horrible rumors about him too. So that was a whole nother, set of circumstances. But he, she had at one point was telling people that she knew he was passed out drunk in his office because she knocked on his door and he didn't answer. And this was literally the level of rumor that was going, that was being thrown at people. But what it became was when the people in power wanted to use the rumors, they did. And so they became a tool of the dysfunction of the organization, of the bullying that was going on. There was quite a lot of bullying. I've always said I can fight bullies. I've fought bullies my whole life. You can't fight a bully when they're your boss. You can't. You can't fight a bully when it's a police officer on the street. You can't fight a bully who's a teacher. Anybody who has absolute power or near absolute power over you, you can't really fight them effectively. And, you know, if it's a peer, sure, that's easy. But, you know, fighting someone who's above you, that's really, really hard. And so the rumors, the gossip, the lies, the chit chat on the side, all these things became, you know, they swirled around and they just became part of gaslighting and bullying that was going on. It was really amazing. In fact, I completely forgot about this, that same institution where I was a dean, that I had a department chair reported to me, who I came to find out was telling my boss and others another complete lie about me, and about the other department chairs in my school. And fortunately, I got wind of this somehow. And I just went to my boss and explained, you know, pretended I didn't know anything about that, and just started talking about the thing he was spreading lies about. It was something we supposedly weren't doing, which we were. And I started explaining what we were doing. We were working on this project, and my boss said, "Oh, I'm so relieved. I heard otherwise." He believed it. He never asked me. He never came to me and said, "Hey, Jim, are you doing this? Are you working on this project I told you to work on?" He just decided I was somehow insubordinate and not working on it. It was very strange. So when you're in a situation like that where people are manipulating their superiors, using gossip, using lies, they can cause untold damage. I mean, I basically left my career over it. You know, I was on a path to become a president, and I decided I just didn't want anything to do with higher ed, because it was such a miasma of just utter nonsense and just disgusting behavior. So, and a lot of it had to do with this gossip thing, and combined with bullying, really.
And so the problem really seems to me that, number one, the leadership seemed to be caught in or roped in by this gossip and these rumors. And then number two, the thing is that there was absolutely no systems in place, like no policies or SOPs, or, you know, like the code of conduct or anything like that. So let's talk about that leadership piece, because I think that those leaders failed you. Definitely, they failed you as an employee, because they should have had your back. They should not have been the person who was roped in by that gossip. So what advice would you give to someone who's in a leadership role at the moment, listening to this podcast, and they feel like the gossip's out of control, they don't know what to do, they, you know, like, even if that's not the case, but they want to be a good leader who does not get roped in by leadership, is there any advice you would give to that person?
Yeah, I mean, and that was my situation, because, you know, I had to protect my people at the same time, and there was gossip about them and rumors about them. You know, and what I would do was I would call people on the carpet. I would ask for explanations. I'd want evidence, right? There's you know, a pretty, it's not an absolute rule, but it's a pretty good rule to follow, that you don't act on something you haven't witnessed if you are in a leadership position, right? If you hear a rumor, you don't act on the rumor. You know, you don't write it down in someone's annual evaluation and slam them with it out of the blue, which did happen to me. You know, so you said such and such. It's like, I never said that. Well, you did. It's like, okay, now what am I supposed to say? But you never heard me say that. Well, I heard somebody told me that you said that. Who? When? You know, it's an impossible situation for the employee. Never put anyone in that position. Resolve now. If you are a boss, resolve now at this moment. Do never do that to anyone. It's absolutely horrendous. If you have not witnessed the behavior, first off, you should never just pocket anything until the annual review, number one. Number two, don't ever listen to a rumor and just nail someone with it. Now, I had to deal with a lot of situations where it was he said, she said. I was dealing with faculty. I was dealing with students. I had situations where, you know, a student would come to me and say, a faculty member said this thing that I interpreted as racist. And they would tell me what the thing was. And I'd be like, yeah, that's pretty bad. It wasn't, you know, flagrant, you know, but it was pretty bad. But it's a he said, she said situation. And now I have to protect the student, but I also have to take the faculty member seriously. So I came up with this technique. I still haven't really come up with a name for it, where I would call somebody in my office when it was one of these situations. I'd always have a witness there. And I would say to them, now here's an accusation that's been put out there. What do you have to say about it? And I would let them talk about it. almost invariably they would deny it, ever saying anything like it, or ever meaning the way it was interpreted. And then by the time they were done, I would say, okay, so we both agree that this would be a very bad thing to do, right? And well, I didn't do it. I'm not saying you did. We're both agreeing this is a very bad thing to do. And they would say, yes. And I so you would never do this ever, right? Right. So I will never hear about anything like this again, right? Right. Okay. We're all in agreement. Can we shake on that? Okay. And that way they got to save face, because I couldn't prove anything. I hadn't witnessed it, but it was a bad enough thing that I needed to intervene, and I needed to protect the student. I needed to make sure it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen to other students. So that was pretty effective, actually. But it just took a lot of resolve on my part not to sort of lash out, because some of these things were, they ticked me off, what I heard. And I knew, and in some cases, I knew the person said it. I could tell by the way they were denying it that they said it and they did it and they knew they did wrong, but I would just get them to agree to that instead. So when you're dealing, so if you're a leader and you're hearing these rumors and there's a credible aspect to them, or they are, so big or so bad that you really need to have a conversation with the person, you need to intervene, don't go in guns a-blazing. It's still a rumor. So unless the person says, yeah, I did it, or you have actual evidence, like multiple people coming, multiple students, whatever, coming to you, then, then you probably want to find a different way of approaching it, because otherwise you're just going to, there's a good chance you're going to ruin someone's life over absolute nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. And I think so I did something similar, and in my time as well, that I held that big leadership role. I also used to call them in, and I used to say, this is what someone has told me. And because I don't want to just act on that, I want to give you the benefit of the doubt. Explain to me what happened in that situation. Was it misconstrued? And so, yes, they would always have the opportunity to basically defend themselves. And then from there, I kind of made a decision whether I needed to take it further or not. But the thing that I always did was I documented everything so that and then I even emailed them afterwards, and I would say, just confirming that this is the conversation that we had. You said this, I said this, summarize it. And then they would have to reply back and say, I confirm that this occurred, or this conversation occurred, because I found that later on, if something similar happened again, then they couldn't come back and say, oh, we never had that conversation, or they couldn't come back and say, oh, yeah, you never spoke to me about that. Because again, it's a he said, she said situation. So how I got around that was get them to email you back. So put it in writing, get them to email you back. And on multiple occasions, it really saved my skin that I could go back to those emails and I could say to them, but you and I agreed on this. You agreed that that never happened. But now I'm hearing another person saying to me something exactly the same, which is concerning to me. So yeah, I think your approach was like really interesting as well in that sense, because you're getting them to agree to the fact that whether they did it or not, they're definitely not going to do it again in the future. Yeah,
Right.
I like that approach. Awesome.
Yeah. It's kind of like firing a shot across their bow. They know they're
Yeah,
being scrutinized and they better clean things up. And my
absolutely.
thing is that I always documented everything, but also I always had the witness in the room. It was usually somebody from HR, somebody outside of, I worked in academic affairs, someone outside our unit, and I always told that person, don't say a word. I don't want to hear a word out of your mouth. You're just here to witness this thing. But it also gave a sense of gravity, right? Like, this is serious stuff. This is really serious stuff. We're not monkeying around here, but, and I've had to fire people and whatnot. I mean, that's happened as well, but, never over rumors.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so surprising to me to hear. You're not the first person in America who says to me that it's so easy to fire someone over just a
Oh
rumor
yeah.
or something like that. And
Oh yeah.
it's really shocking to me that someone can get dismissed so quickly. So is there any, like, is that going to change? Like, do you have
No,
any hope that will ever change?
no. I'll explain exactly what's going on there. So unless you have a union representing you, or some sort of contract, like a really good contract, or in the case of like a university tenure, um, unless you have that sort of protection, you are at will. And that's virtually every employee. There's 50 states, 49 of them are called at will states. The only one that isn't is the state of Montana, which is bizarre beyond belief. And in Montana, after you've been, it's very much, I know how in Europe, it's like if you've worked for 30 days or 60 days, then all of a sudden you get all these protections. And in Montana, it's almost identical to that. But in the rest of the states, every state is at will. So unless you have those protections, and a lot of times there's easy ways to get around them anyhow. If you have a contract, they just buy out your contract. Or there's a lot of ways of getting around it. There's absolutely, beyond the union movement here, there's absolutely no movement to change that. I've literally never heard a politician or an activist say, hey, let's get rid of the at-will rules in such and such state. I'd fall over, and it would be a good thing, because I even knew I was an employer and I had people working for me and I could fire them at will. I never found that to be my advantage, to my advantage. If you're a pretty bad leader, if you got to use at will, you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and so for context here, in Australia, we've got what's called the Fair Work Commission. And so if you absolutely cannot just get fired, like it doesn't work like that here. So yeah, the employees are extremely protected, and in some senses they're so protected that it's really, really hard. If you do need to dismiss them or fire them, then it's quite impossible. And so in some senses, that's kind of like the opposite again. And so that's why I had to get really good at documentation, because if I did have to fire someone and they claimed unfair dismissal with Fair Work, then I had to have the evidence. I had to lawyer up, and I had all my evidence ready. And so I think in that sense, the organization I worked for was really good, because they helped me from the beginning to do those things right. So I never got into trouble, thank goodness, for doing the wrong thing, because I had really, really solid and good leaders. But what they didn't know how to do was how to deal with gossip. Gossip was always this issue. And so, from my perspective, I was just like, well, I've been a victim of gossip. I was a gossiper. I've been a victim of gossip, and I've seen the worst of it. I'm just not going to have it. I'm just going to do everything in my power to not tolerate that. And it was actually in that space where a couple of people had to go, like because they were unwilling to change. They had fixed mindsets. They wanted to be toxic. And so they either left willingly, or, they had to be let go. So yeah, it's so super interesting how different things work around the world. So yeah, go Montana.
Well, and I worked in tenured systems, so the faculty by and large had tenure, which, tenure is, it's very hard to dismiss someone with tenure. Very difficult. And it should be, for a lot of different reasons. I'm not against that at all. But then there were, we had professors who were just taking up space, probably should be retired, and they weren't very good teachers. They weren't doing any research. They were just living off their tenure. In some cases, they might have been malevolent towards students, pretty nasty people. And everyone was afraid of them because they had tenure. And I had to figure out how do you get them to retire? And I had all these techniques for doing it. It had to be voluntary, but I would just sort of motivate them. A lot of it was I would just start scrutinizing them. We started having a lot of tough conversations, and they didn't like that, because nobody had ever bothered to tell them, you need to stop bullying students from time to time. That's not a good thing. Nobody had ever called them out on that. I didn't get angry or freak out. I was all very civil. Always let them have their say. But it put them on notice that they were being scrutinized. And then all of a sudden, this wasn't such a comfortable place to be. They were being singled out. And next thing you know, they're taking retirement without me saying a word.
I think you just really made a good point there about having difficult conversations, because, a lot of leaders I speak to in this space now that, with workplace gossip, they're very scared of conflict. They're very scared of having those tough conversations, because they don't know how the other person's going to react. And so I always say, well, their reaction is on them. It's not on you. So long as you remain in control of your emotions and what you say, and you mentioned just then that you remained very calm, you didn't get upset. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about this tough conversation bit, because people can be so scared of tough conversations. So, what advice would you give to someone who's like petrified of tough conversations, and how should they go about dealing with that?
Well, I'm notorious for being a straight talker. I'm a rip the Band-Aid off kind of guy. So I don't really beat around the bush much. I get right to the point, and I can be quite emotional, but I try to do it with as little emotion as possible. So collecting my thoughts, knowing what I'm going to say going into the situation. You can't control the other person. You have no idea what they're going to say or do. So you need to be sort of prepared for everything, but you need to also have the script in your head of what you want to say, what you want to accomplish. You have to think about what the outcome is going to be. If it's an exploratory conversation where you're just trying to figure out what's going on, that's one thing. But if it's really, you want a result here, you want this person to change their behavior or something like that, then you got to go in with that goal in mind, and you got to think like that. And I'm going to say, here's me being a straight shooter. I'm going to say something pretty harsh. If you are a manager and you are afraid of confrontation and you are not confronting people, and I don't mean in a bad way, I mean, you're not dealing with things, you are not being competent. That is a sign of incompetence. And I've had managers like that, where they did not, my one boss said to me, I'm afraid of, and they didn't say afraid of conversations. I don't like confrontation. And what that meant was, he avoided confrontation as much as possible. And then when he did confront somebody, it was full bore screaming the whole 9 yards. He was a yeller. And that's a very typical situation. People, when they finally do confront, because they're afraid of it, they yell and they bully and they bluster and they do all these things, which is completely unproductive. I also have another saying: there's a special place in hell for bosses who yell. If the building's on fire, yell. Okay. If someone's physically hurting someone, yell. Okay. Otherwise, you probably shouldn't be yelling. I can't really think of a reason for yelling. And so that's another reality. People, leaders, and this goes back to John Amici, leaders need to watch their behavior. It's not what's going on in your head. It's not your thoughts. It's not your biases. It's not your unconscious biases. It's none of that. It's how you behave, is the point that he makes. He's an occupational psychologist, and he says, Amici says that, we have unconscious bias. We all do. And we can't control that. What we can control is how we react to it. If we know it's wrong, we shouldn't do it. And yelling is always wrong.
I think that is excellent. I love it. I love this whole conversation. I love this leadership topic because it, I always challenge people and challenge leaders. And so this is one of the things that I've done a lot on the podcast as well, is to challenge the listeners to say, you can't just sit backwards and think that you can be a leader in your chair. You can't be a leader that way. You need to, you need to be with your team and the way you behave 100%. I think that integrity piece is so crucial as well, because we behave a certain way, but then we can't say one thing and do another thing. Those two need to absolutely match up. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think this was an extremely insightful conversation. Now, where can people connect with you, Jim?
So the easiest thing to do is go to my website, which is, my company is Guidance for Greatness. So it's Guidance for Greatness, all one word, .com. There's a free resource there called the Great Leadership Toolkit, and you can find that at thegreatleadershiptoolkit.com or at my website, guidanceforgreatness.com. And also, I have a podcast and blog that I do. I write an essay every week and I read it aloud and record it. Some people read it, some people listen to it. And that is called On Leading with Greatness. And that is on Substack at jimsalvucci.substack.com.
Okay, and I'll make sure that I pop all those links in the show notes below for the listeners as well. That is sounds great. Sounds awesome. Well, thank you so very much. And I actually look forward to chatting with you again very soon.
Excellent. This has been fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the series Conversation about Gossip, and I really hope that you enjoyed that episode. If you've not done so, come and join the conversation on the Facebook group. Go to womenoffaithinleadership.com or go to Facebook and search for Women of Faith in Leadership Community. You can find us there. And if you've not done so yet, please leave a review for the show, because that means that I can just really get the word out there about the podcast, get other women of faith in leadership to listen to the podcast and join the community as well. And I really hope that you will be blessed this week, and I hope that you will know that God is with you every single day, no matter how much trials and tribulations you will go through. And if you feel far away from God, He's not far away from you. He's just there, holding out His hand and wishing that you would hold His hand back and just trust Him. So that's my prayer for you for this week, is that you would just lean into God as you face your trials and tribulations, both those good and bad things. Just lean into Him, trust Him, lean on the Word, and put on the armor of God as you go through your week this week. And God bless you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye. Thanks so much for listening. If this podcast blessed you in some way, the number one way you can thank me is by leaving a review. Your feedback means the world to me and lights me up every single time when I read it, and it makes me want to keep going. So please leave a review, and your review will also help other Christian women in leadership find the answers they are looking for. So whether you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, scroll down to the review section and leave that review. Then head over to womenoffaithinleadership.com and join our free Facebook community, and I look forward to engaging with you there.